All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm sure we have a few more folks trickling in, but I want to get started. So, welcome to the NWSA webinar series. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Joelle Marier. I am the Executive Director of the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance. It's great to have you here to learn about building a stewardship arm of an advocacy organization. And we're here with Bjorn Fredrickson from New Mexico Wild and Jeremy Lynch from Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. Even if you aren't an advocacy organization or from the nonprofit sector, I think their insights will apply across your partnerships and might help spark some new ideas for your own programs. I'll share a bit more about our presenters in a moment, but first, just a bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded. If you registered, you'll receive a link to the recording via email along with a feedback survey. We'll also post the recording on our YouTube channel so you can share it with friends and colleagues. We are scheduled for 1 hour today and we'll reserve time for questions at the end. If you have questions during the presentation, please place them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible during the Q&A. If there ends up being lively discussion, we can stretch to an additional 15 minutes after the top of the hour. Out of respect for our presenters and other participants, please mute your microphone throughout the webinar unless you are asked to share your question during the Q&A. So with that, let's jump in. Today, I'm excited to welcome Bjorn Fredrickson and Jeremy Lynch. Bjorn joins us as the Conservation Director for New Mexico Wilderness Alliance, or you might hear him refer to the organization as New Mexico Wild, where he leads several of the organization's advocacy campaigns, as well as its stewardship, outreach, and GIS programs and staff. Prior to this role, Bjorn spent 13 years working for the U.S. Forest Service, managing recreation, wilderness, wild and scenic rivers, and numerous other programs in Washington, D.C., Washington State, California, and New Mexico. While working for the agency in New Mexico, Bjorn helped to form the stewardship program at New Mexico Wild that he'll be talking about today. Jeremy joins us as Oops, sorry, I had to admit a few people. Jeremy joins us as the Stewardship Director for Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. Since 2016, he's been building their volunteer-supported stewardship program and forging resilient partnerships with the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. Through his work, SUWA preserves and restores the fragile desert ecosystems impacted by Utah's burgeoning recreation economy using visitor education and hands-on stewardship. NWSA is proud to have funded stewardship projects completed by both of these organizations through the Wilderness Stewardship Performance Grant Program that we offer in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jeremy and Bjorn. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks for the introduction and welcome everybody. I think we can start with our presentation, so we'll just jump right into it. The title of it, I was reflecting on last night, growing a stewardship arm within an advocacy organization. I just want to keep that in mind as we go through the presentation and as we get toward the end and there's space for questions, just to have an opportunity to reflect a little bit on that, both on my part, Bjorn's part, as well as everyone in the room. Let's move through. Okay, so starting with Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. Some of you may be familiar. We were founded in 1983. I wrote it as heir to the Wilderness Act, driven by citizen activism and these ethical underpinnings that were the catalysts for a public-driven wilderness inventory. Essentially, the need, the perceived need and the tangible need to preserve what was left of the wildlands in Utah, the wild wilderness places, and what became our mission statement to preserve the outstanding wilderness at the heart of the Colorado Plateau and ensure the management of these lands in their natural state for the benefit of all. So you'll see the map on the left identifies, various designations of lands, kind of hard to see, but there's wilderness, there's lands with wilderness characteristics, there's wilderness study areas, which were a large part of the volunteer inventory that a great number of people engaged in, especially in the early 90s, which set the stage for what became our flagship legislation, America's Red Rock Wilderness Act, which we introduce still to this day in an effort to protect these lands. But in addition to all of that, we are an organization that is much more multifaceted, especially today as compared with at its origin point, when, as it's always been described to me, where there were a ragtag bunch of desert rats doing their best to protect the wildlands in Utah. Now we have a series of teams that are interconnected and drive a diverse, really multi-pronged approach to advocacy, supporting the agency, and ultimately protecting wilderness. And so, as was mentioned, 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, the program that I run, the Stewardship Program, was born of our Wildlands Program, which is essentially, and prior to, were our attorneys who work specifically with BLM, typically, sometimes Forest Service field offices across the state of Utah to work on various issues, whether it was travel management, leasing, oil and gas, or other forms of leasing, all in an effort to protect and preserve wilderness. And what we found was that, and this is a theme that'll probably keep reemerging, is that, the defensive is essential, as is the olive branch. And so our stewardship program was created to kind of counterbalance a lot of lawsuits, a lot of, necessary conflict to achieve our mission. And so our stewardship program has been operating to build relationships with good folks who work on the ground, sometimes are, wildly underfunded in what their mission is, especially with regard to the BLM. And our directive is, and has always been, to work toward the protection specifically of wilderness, with the understanding that the BLM, is managing for multiple resources and multiple uses. So there's a lot there. But I just wanted to show the web of our organizing, our teams across the country. We have organizers in DC, up and down the East Coast, in the Midwest, in the West Coast, across the Southwest. It's a really wide network of folks that aren't just staff, but are people who, meet with their Congress people, join us for Wilderness Week every year. And so I was very fortunate to step into a circumstance in which we have a wildly passionate, enthusiastic supporter base, and that supporter base has become a big part of our stewardship volunteerism. So that's our starting point. Bjorn?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. So New Mexico Wild, Joel mentioned New Mexico Wilderness Alliance. That is our legal name, and I'll talk about a little bit about why we changed that from a branding standpoint to call ourselves, for the most part, New Mexico Wild these days, and that just reflects kind of a broadening in scope of our organizational strategy over the years. But yeah, still legally the New Mexico Wilderness Alliance, doing business as New Mexico Wild. And our mission is dedicated to the protection, restoration, and continued enjoyment of New Mexico's wildlands and wilderness areas. We were formed formally as a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization in 1997, which grew out of a volunteer-based effort, kind of similar origin story to kind of what Jeremy just described in terms of how SUWA came to be, although we were always, a little behind the curve in terms of the timeline there, but grew out of volunteer-based effort called the New Mexico Wilderness Study Committee, which had kind of roots and affiliation with Earth First, and that was conceived of as a quote unquote small o, excuse me, organization conceived of in 1968 following the passage of the Wilderness Act to really kind of engage citizens in the protection of wilderness and the management of wilderness. And so again, kind of heavy focus on citizen inventories beginning with national forest lands in the early 70s and kind of moving into BLM lands in the later 70s. Inventory work continues to this day, both with kind of paid staff, depending on the time and the resources available, and volunteers. And so we still kind of hold true to those roots of this organization from its kind of inception as a volunteer-based organization. And this New Mexico Wilderness Study Committee was instrumental in the passage of the 1980 New Mexico Wilderness Act, for example, which was one of the few big omnibus bills that kind of gave us multiple wilderness designations in the history of this state. So yeah, very serious, accomplished effort by these citizens, and again kind of gelled into forming a formal nonprofit with professional staff in 1997, like I said. So I mentioned our organizational strategy has evolved over the years in terms of how we pursue our goals to achieve our mission. And so when the organization was founded in 97, the work was kind of focused on the pursuit of wilderness designation, public lands defense. So, that's a term we use for those not familiar, that you could kind of call like watchdog type of work to ensure that public lands are appropriately managed in terms of like the legal and regulatory framework. So we do that, kind of always had roots in this public lands defense work. And then also on the Mexican gray wolf recovery, kind of how the organization started with its kind of three main focal points. That kind of expanded in the kind of early 2000s to include other pursuit of other protective designations, and most notably at first national monuments. And so that was a big discussion with the board in the 2000s around, are we purely a wilderness organization, or would we pursue these other designations to protect special places on our federal lands? Um, Stewardship has always been a component of our work to some extent, although we later formally founded a stewardship program. We call it a Wilderness Ranger program, is kind of the core of our stewardship program now. And then more recently, we've expanded into a broader array of work around water and wildlife protection, and a lot of that's done at the state level. So you can sort of see over the years, our work has kind of expanded in scope and topic area to be a little more holistic than it began in 1997. Um, I wanted to show a map kind of like Jeremy shared. So this is probably not really possible to read on this screen, but this is a map of existing protected areas in New Mexico and other potential protected areas. And so, like Jeremy said, that includes wilderness study areas, and includes lands with wilderness characteristics, Forest Service recommended wilderness, other lands that the agencies have identified as having wilderness characteristics, but not designated as such to be protected, inventoried roadless areas, and then our own citizen kind of inventory work. And so that totals about 6.5 million acres of other land that we believe could merit wilderness protection beyond what's protected as wilderness currently. I'll go next slide. Okay, so Jeremy and I are going to kind of flip-flop through this discussion, but so I'm going to jump into kind of an overview of New Mexico Wild's stewardship program. I kind of referenced this. We've always had some level of stewardship activities ongoing, most notably early on through our campaign and advocacy and organizing work in communities. And that was just a way to engage people in kind of hands-on contributions to protecting public lands and associated resources. That's, historically been a fairly limited scope in terms of the amount of that work occurring, but certainly the organization did engage in that. And that could include things like trash cleanups, again, citizen-based wilderness inventory, monitoring, and other scattered sort of small stewardship projects. That could be a trail project. It could be a signage project, but kind of what probably those of you who work with NWSA more routinely might think about as stewardship. Um, Joelle mentioned this in my bio. I had the kind of pleasure to help to form New Mexico Wild's Wilderness Ranger program from the other side of the equation with the Forest Service in 2017, and kind of neat to come full circle and be working with that same program on the other side of the partnership now. And kind of interestingly, Joelle was the person at the time with New Mexico Wild that I worked most closely with to kind of form that program. So it's kind of neat to be here today to talk to you about what we've learned along the way. This Wilderness Ranger program is started basically exclusively using a partnership agreement with the Forest Service and federal funding with paid seasonal staff and volunteer engagement. Our program has kind of continued to grow and evolve over the years to include more and more non-federal funds, so in the form of state funding primarily, and also kind of outside the scope of the Wilderness Ranger work with our stewardship staff. Kind of a growing emphasis on urban and community stewardship work as well. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, quick roughshot overview of the work we do with our Wilderness Rangers and Stewardship program more broadly. So when this Ranger program formed, it was kind of under the rubric of what the Forest Service then called the 10-year Wilderness Stewardship Challenge. And that was a very heavy kind of emphasis on data collection, informing understanding of stewardship needs and actions with follow-up monitoring to determine effectiveness of management actions in wilderness. And this sort of cycle continues. So we use phones and tablets to collect a variety of data on management issues and needs in wilderness. So next slide. Okay, we have always been asked to contribute to trail maintenance, and we look at that as far as promoting public access to and enjoyment of New Mexico's wilderness areas. This kind of portfolio of work within our stewardship program is expanding, particularly in light of kind of post-fire trail maintenance needs, and kind of comprises like a majority of our work nowadays, actually. So we're kind of started as a broader kind of approach toward a wide array of stewardship activities, and we still dabble in all of that, but more and more we see kind of asked around trail maintenance. So a lot of trail work that includes signage and whatnot. And again, this is a great opportunity to engage volunteers. So next slide. We do a lot of work around wilderness education. We develop interpretation for the Forest Service. We have that fabricated. We get kiosks. We install it all. So there's a photo of that. Again, great way to work with volunteers. We do work around the removal and treatment of non-native invasive species. We do a lot of like campsite rehab and small scale restoration projects as part of this work. Next slide. We do work around, for example, addressing motorized incursion. So this picture on the left is a wilderness study area that has had issues on the Gila National Forest with motorized trespass. And so we did a series of projects to kind of block these motorized routes into the WSA. I mentioned a lot of our campaigns for a long time have done cleanup projects with community advocates. And so there's a couple photos on that front. Next slide. I mentioned we're doing more and more urban-based stewardship work. And so our organization has its sort of primary office and bulk of our staff based out of Albuquerque. We have the Rio Grande running through town that has a cottonwood, bosque, riparian forest along the river. And so it's a neat wild space right through the middle of town. And in this vein of just kind of saying, like, we want to be good stewards in our community, we work on protection of wildlife and water more and more now. We decided that it made sense to expand into doing community-based projects in the bosque to benefit wildlife habitat and water quality right here in our home community. And as a way to kind of raise awareness about broader wildlands and public lands in New Mexico. So it's kind of provides an entry point to have a conversation with people about what we do as an organization and the wealth of wonderful places that we all co-own as Americans across the state. Another example is we have Petroglyph National Monument here in Albuquerque, and so we did a community-based cleanup there as well. So kind of neat opportunities with public lands, within and surrounding Albuquerque is a great way to engage people and again do good for the place. We can go to the next slide. And then this is a photo of what we call our Wilderness Defenders Program, and that is generally a monitoring and inventory-based kind of community where, again, we engage people that help us like look at documenting lands with wilderness characteristics or other management issues, and that's another way to inform stewardship projects in the form of identifying needs. And so this is another kind of component of our kind of volunteer-based engagement in our larger stewardship program with, again, other facets around inventory and monitoring, like I said. And so then I think we are back to you, Jeremy.
Sounds good. It's interesting and fascinating to see the confluence of the kinds of work that are done across the West and the needs that are shared between, in particular, in this case, our two organizations. So I appreciate seeing all of that. As for our stewardship program, I'll just talk a little bit more about it. Inaugurated in 2016, branched from our wildlands team, like I said, to offer SUWA's multi-decade organizational expertise in the service of agency land management, while persisting as an organization in advocacy. Could we offer support in protecting the resource as well? Could we, not be a friends group, but still be friendly? My answer has always been yes, and I think that's why it's continued to work, among other reasons. We've got exceptional membership and volunteer base, cultivated by decades of organizing. And so that is a building block of what we're doing. But on top of that, we've now built through the stewardship program strong relationships with the public and agency staff, the people in the landscapes we're working to protect. Agency staff, I don't know if it's the same everywhere in Utah, is often on a very rotational grazing pattern. And so people come and go a lot. And we do our best to be in offices and to build relationships and to get to know people. But we're often rebuilding those relationships constantly. And so the stewardship side of things, while everything else is going on with our organization, litigation, legislation, advocacy, and organizing, we're constantly on the ground interacting with the people that we're working with, as well as the public that are coming out to work with us. And one other thing we do, just generally speaking, that we're grateful and able to do is, in addition to offering labor, we can provide some basis of financial support. There was a grant I was able to write a few years ago that greatly helped our work with one particular office. And above and beyond that, at different times when funds are short, we can support purchasing materials, whether it's buck and rail fencing or something along those lines, really so that we can get the projects done that we want to see get done, because there's obviously longer lists than you'll ever be able to read in terms of what needs to get done out there. And we have our priorities, wilderness and protected lands, particularly those lands contained within ARWA, and we'll always support with labor and fiscally the management of those spaces. And so that offer often works. And I'm going to run through just a couple of similar image slides and just go over a couple of aspects and facets of our organization and what we're doing. And then I think we'll dive into a couple of the main topics of this conversation, around building relationships and the challenges and things like that. And so a couple photos here of just representing a decade of developing restoration and naturalization strategies with our agency partners. We learn from the people we're working with, whether it's what we're calling Cairn baskets in that photo on the right, or the gentleman in the center on the photo on the left wrapped in a rock net that we learned about from the Ashley National Forest, and then brought down to the desert to move big boulders to learn how to iceberg and manage for off-road vehicle travel. We're always constantly learning from our agency partners. So it's this mutualistic, beneficial relationship when it's working at its best. There are also plenty of folks out there who, I've known for 10 years now. Unfortunately, some of them have left more recently for reasons you might suspect. And they have provided institutional knowledge or landscape-based knowledge that has informed our program and will continue to inform our program indefinitely. And so that benefit of being able to support people who support agency staff who maybe don't have the resources or even fellow staff to work with is what we can provide, and their knowledge and their expertise and their understanding of the landscape is how we balance that equation. And obviously, we love bringing out maps and leaning on a tailgate. We work mostly with the BLM, primarily because those are where most of our lands that have not been designated wilderness exist. But we work with Forest Service partners as well in our monuments. It's great to work with the Forest Service, and currently we're branching out a little bit and looking into working with the NPS in places where there are many of them, boundaries between BLM, Forest Service lands, and, for example, the Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. So there's a lot to be said about partnerships, but we seek to work with everybody, so long as they're willing to work with us on the issues that we're primarily focused on. And a big part of our program that has emerged over time is that educational piece that Bjorn also spoke about, which is we do our best to engage young people, students. Our program is based in Moab, and so we work as much as we can with students in the northern part of the state. So coming from the community colleges, the universities, clubs, any number of people. We have organizers up there who work with particular communities, Latino community and others. And we seek to bring students out, for an experiential opportunity, but also to learn about management. And, in an ideal sense, as we develop this, maybe some more on the ground training for what could become professional careers for some of these people. And so we do this as much as we can. And we love to consider the field an outdoor classroom. Initially, when we started our program, we had an exceptional number of members who had been with us for decades. And now we see a wonderful mix of intergenerational folks who have stories to exchange, various levels of experience, and a lot to offer in the spaces when we're working and when we're not working, to create more community around what it is we're doing with stewardship, which then translates via a pipeline back to the advocacy that we're working on as a broader organization. I mentioned this a little bit before, but I'll just touch on it again, providing labor and financial support wherever we can. There are certain things that, I know certain folks at the BLM wouldn't be able to do, like that picture on the bottom right, without people willing to carry logs of that nature. And so that was the kind of like gritty beginnings of our program, and remains a tenet of it. But we seek to continue to move above and beyond in terms of how we partner, develop relationships in the sense of, longer term project work, building trust such that, in Utah, it can be difficult with our organization. It can be difficult to be able to address sites with agency folks on site, and then potentially in the future return to those sites and work on those sites and report back. That's one of the big challenges that we face sometimes, is a lack of trust, but we'll talk a little bit about trust in just a few moments. We believe that it reduces agency workload when we have a many hands approach. You can see that tree that, I don't know, 12 people are carrying there. Sometimes we get feedback, and maybe others here have opinions that, of course, volunteer management itself is a workload, but we seek to take on as much of that as possible. It's really just a matter of paperwork and reviewing the project proposals that we work through our GIS team and bring to the agency. So we minimize as best we can the work that we bring to these folks. And we have, I did notice that maybe some of them are in this room right now, but we have a wonderful team of 3 people on our stewardship program. Myself, Talitha McGuire, and Ellie Swanson, both of whom lead all of our projects and are our stewardship coordinators in the field. So we're a relatively small team working the entire state, and developing project proposals, executing them, reporting back. But we also work within, as I mentioned before, the wildlands team, which includes a few other folks who are doing similar field work on the ground. And so we do our best to reduce workload, and we see that as a benefit, and we hope they do too. Just a couple of photos I threw in here, just some work that we've done dealing with, non-permitted routes. Nothing too much to say about here, except that this is kind of how we started. We wanted to ensure that, strategies were taken by the agency to protect these areas. And sometimes they would bring them to us, sometimes we would bring them to them, and it was iterative. And so you'll see some of our early projects held up really well over time. Some of them we need to go back and fix. And then other times you wouldn't maybe even notice that there was, a non-permitted route there. And signs often help with that. So just to share. Last photo, a couple of the offices we've been able to work with, and I think this is an important point to make because it's rare for us, and I don't know if it's rare for you, Bjorn. We have gained trust to be able to work in really far-flung places, with BLM coordination, but not necessarily folks on the ground. And so I'll mention again in a few minutes about the GIS work that we do. But we've been clear out in the middle of the West Desert, the top of the Amasa Basin and these island ranges and these wilderness study areas. Building fences and that level of trust it goes a long way in perpetuating long-term relationships, even as staff overturn in an office. And it's just a big part of our program, and it's something that we hope over time will advance, maybe not in the immediate future, but in the long term. And back to
Yeah.
you, Bjorn.
Thanks, Jeremy. And again, like Jeremy has said, you're going to hear some similar themes and maybe a different kind of organization, how we kind of approach this stuff. So we're gonna kind of kick off some of the kind of key points that Jeremy and I think are important for folks to know in terms of if you're affiliated with an advocacy organization, thinking about building a stewardship program or growing a stewardship program, or vice versa, and kind of getting to the meat of this discussion. And so one of the big themes we wanted to talk about is the fact that stewardship partnerships benefit all parties, right? And so um, previously working for the Forest Service, now with New Mexico Wild, I can safely say that there is a mutual interest by all involved in stewardship work, enhancing the protection of public lands that may be designated as wilderness or some other designation. And the old adage, like, drawing a line on a map around a place is not the final word in its protection. So this work helps our agency partners protect designated places, and that's an important part of our mission as well. Um, I think Jeremy kind of referenced this, but the capacity factor is a kind of a key part of this work in terms of adding agency capacity in terms of addressing stewardship priorities. And that was really why I sort of initially started a conversation with New Mexico Wild that kind of resulted in this ranger program forming in 2017 as a partnership between the two organizations. But to say, like, we just don't have the bandwidth and the staffing to do all of the work that we want and need to do in wilderness areas in New Mexico. So maybe New Mexico Wild would have an interest in playing a role in that by again bringing on paid staff and engaging volunteers. I think, as we all know, like, that capacity issue for boots on the ground management of our public lands is only getting to be more important, an issue with kind of the workforce reductions and firings of federal staff now. So that's another big benefit. Um, Engaging volunteers and supporters in the stewardship work, of course, increases public awareness of the federal land management agencies, public lands issues, but also of the organizations that are involved and organizational missions and the work that we do as a nonprofit now, for example. So again, benefits all around on kind of an increased awareness kind of front. And then I think partnerships bring resources, money, and capacity to all parties. And so again, um, initially with our Wilderness Ranger partnership with the Forest Service, we were obtaining federal funding to make that work happen. So that helped New Mexico Wild grow its suite of programs and offerings and ways to engage the public. On the flip side now, we are bringing in more and more non-federal money, and so state funds, for example. So that allows us to work with land management agencies, offices, and staffs to do important work that they couldn't otherwise do due to lack of financial resources and funding. And then, of course, there's all the other non-financial or non-cash contributions to this work in the form of volunteer engagement, community engagement, for example. So there's a few of the benefits I wanted to highlight. Jeremy, I don't know if you have more to add on that, or you want to segue into your slides here.
Sure, I'll do that. Well, I guess I'll just jump into what the next slide is, which is trust on the ground. But I will say, leveraging success to fund more is kind of what I was referring to before. We have been able to use our program after a certain amount of time to grant fund, and mostly on the federal level. Uh, I'm grateful other folks can receive funds from their state, but it's hard to imagine us being able to do that here in Utah. But maybe there is an avenue that will open up for us at some point. But federal funds and the graciousness of our membership is what really gets us where we're going. So just to add on to what we were just speaking to, as for building trust on the ground, there's a lot to that. And I think we talk about it a lot, as I mentioned before, as the tailgate talk. Just this past week, myself and Talitha went out with a BLM staff person, and we looked at a site we had worked on in the past. And we just had conversation for 2 hours, maybe more, about the work itself, about the dynamics of the office, the dynamics of, being a partner with an agency office in Utah right now. And there's almost nothing more valuable than that, what can be considered casual, but also very intentional conversation. And it's something that we've, always had at the fore. Field office has always been our focus. As I mentioned before, prior to our wildlands team creating the stewardship program, we had three wildlands attorneys who essentially were going out onto the ground, uh, you know, doing some field work and then meeting with field offices largely on the legal front. Now we do that. We do those same activities, except when we're going to the field offices, we're offering help. We're offering, help in management and, what needs to get done. And so we've shifted the narrative a bit there while allowing for both to still exist. Sometimes we run into conflict. That's if we're going to talk about conflict, which I think we will at some point, we run into that here and there. But at the same time, there are ways to strike a balance. And a lot of that has to do with internal communication at our organization. Another thing that I mentioned previously that really helps build trust is our GIS mapping. In the time that I've worked for SUWA, we started with one. He might have been a part-time GIS specialist, and now we have two. And so we have this resource in which we can, sometimes in a matter of a day, turn around, come back from the field, have 100 field work points and create, viewable maps that we can then send over to the BLM and say, would you please review and approve work sites for this upcoming project? And that level of kind of like technological advancement from the days of us carrying paper maps and circling things and hoping they match up with the landscape has really made a difference. And really, I think, impresses the agency folks we work with because we're putting a lot of effort into, how strict we are and how by the book we are with regard to what we're doing in the field. Um, we're consistent, but we're flexible. When starting to work with a new office, we'll be flexible with the kind of work that we do. If something is a priority for an office, we'll help them get it done. They know our priorities because we lay them out at the front, but we want to build these relationships. And so that's where it begins, is figuring out, IDing our shared goals, but also, balancing what needs to get done, so that they, can achieve their jobs and have capacity then to work with us. So in this case, trust, huge for us, especially in Utah. And these are some of the strategies that we use to move through those spaces. I'll jump to the next slide. And this is just a continuation of what I was speaking to. It's going to be a little hard to see, but essentially it's a version of one of the project proposals that we came up with. So some mapping. On the map, you'll see tiny little dots if you can. And those are all sites that have been identified via field work using, ArcGIS, now called field maps, various, phone-based apps in which we've identified, for example, there's an ORV incursion into a wilderness study area or a wilderness area. And then we sync that with a written report that, specifies by number each site, what's going on, what we want to see happen, what we recommend should happen, and then we have a dialogue back and forth. And so again, it's just building this trust, but doing our best to, not just fly by the seat of our pants, which may have been part of what we were doing in the past, not always, certainly. But with the stewardship program now in place, it's an opportunity that is afforded to the organization that I think bolsters the perception in a lot of cases of most of us. There's always folks with a grudge, but this is a great way to build relationships with folks. I'll jump back to you, Bjorn.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. So another kind of theme we wanted to talk about is how stewardship kind of contributes to or enhances advocacy efforts and in a lot of ways, like indirectly. And so we've talked a lot about community and volunteer engagement, and of course, involving people in stewardship work is a tangible way for them to feel like they're contributing, giving back, getting engaged, doing something positive. That, of course, helps us like as an organization, New Mexico Wild or SUWA, build new relationships, create brand awareness for the work that we do as organizations, and that can be really particularly true in these kind of rural communities that surround public lands and can be harder for nonprofit conservation organizations to kind of break into. And so I think this notion of stewardship helps us get to know people and vice versa and build relationships, build trust, build awareness. Um, Partnership-based work, where we have a request for collection of monitoring data by an agency can directly contribute to advocacy goals as well. So, for example, we had a project based on a competitive BLM grant where they were asking us to do an updated inventory of the wilderness characteristics in wilderness study areas. And so that was like a kind of a performance measure need on the part of kind of local BLM offices. They brought us in to do that work, and that work is important to us as well. And as far as kind of understanding trends in or changes to the kind of wilderness characteristics of these wilderness study areas. So kind of again, kind of mutual interest in a given project, but maybe different applications of the information kind of benefiting both the land management agency and the nonprofit. Um, and then I mentioned that advocacy, um, creates, I mean, it offers opportunities to, just engage people and kind of creating stewardship opportunities, right? And so it's again back to that premise of designation doesn't mean that an area is protected. It may need ongoing management and care. And so I think just that notion of getting people to care about a place creates this interest, again, this kind of theme around people giving back and wanting to engage, wanting to help, and wanting to engage in stewardship. And so I think kind of, stewardship work contributes to advocacy and vice versa, I guess, in some here with this kind of theme on my end, and hand it back to Jeremy.
It sounds like we work in a very similar field. So one of the things I wanted to mention was, the reciprocity of stewardship and advocacy, just kind of building off what you were talking about as teaching tools, and how we integrate stewardship and advocacy programming before, during, and post project. We work with our organizers to uh, bring people out into the field, whether it's through scholarships or through independent projects. For example, we're going to have our project working out in the La Salle Mountains this year, led by our Latino community organizer, bringing folks out to celebrate Latino uh, Community Week. And in addition to that, we are always seeking to create that volunteer pipeline that I mentioned before, because, in-field education, opportunities to bring out speakers, as we've done on a variety of projects, people from very different backgrounds, people with very strong local knowledge, indigenous folks from the regions in which we're entering to do work, really brings it back to the web and that sense of reciprocity. And the way that I was thinking about it last night was, the work is central. The stewardship work is central to everything it is we're doing, because, if you look back at our mission in protecting these lands and, protecting them in perpetuity, the work is central, but the human and the wild experience binds stewardship to advocacy. And so, um, not to say that I believe alone that being out there is the thing that does it, but it's the community that forms around it. So not necessarily that you need to be on the ground. I think it helps some people in some ways, but there is, I think, an inherent connection between that knowledge base, that learning, that understanding of how lands are managed, whether you're learning it from us, from someone we invite to speak, from the Forest Service, from the BLM, from anyone working at a land agency. uh, the more knowledge we have, the better informed we're going to be when we next go out onto these public lands, because most of what we're dealing with are, people that don't have malintent. They just, don't know how to drive through the desert or don't know how to hike through the desert. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is provide that baseline education before, during, and then connecting back to our organizers as best we can after each of our projects. And we hold events outside of uh, our stewardship projects to celebrate, as a couple of these photos show our 10th anniversary earlier this year. And one of our favorite rangers who has since retired from down in Grand Staircase Escalante.
Okay, so Jeremy and I are going to share some kind of key lessons learned from our kind of engagement and stewardship programs within advocacy organizations before diving into some opportunity for further discussion, Q&A with you all. Some of the key lessons in my journey that I've learned along the way is first and foremost around trust building, and that's been talked about quite a bit already. It's essential. It can be difficult. I remember when I first kind of pitched the idea of like, what if we partnered with New Mexico Wild to employ wilderness rangers through a partnership, through competitive funds that weren't really viable to use for kind of Forest Service-based staffing. There were people that kind of raised their eyebrows and like, hey, that's an advocacy organization. Why would we work with them? They have an agenda. And so that necessitated, some real careful discussion between myself at the time and New Mexico Wild around like we really have to have this be purely a stewardship focus and a stewardship partnership, and not, we need a firewall between your advocacy work, given that we're using federal funds to kind of cover these salary costs for these wilderness rangers. And so that took some time to kind of bear out and prove out, but kind of bring people along. I think like this notion of like, you're working with like quote unquote innovators to prove out a concept is kind of like a duh moment to me. But finding those people in the agency that were excited to partner and kind of work with New Mexico Wild to prove it out was super successful. Another sort of like unintended blessing we had is that we initially set this up to have wilderness rangers employed by New Mexico Wild embedded on specific national forests and ranger districts. And that often meant that they were staying in Forest Service housing. And that just helped again to build really strong relationships between New Mexico Wild staff in the form of these wilderness rangers and local Forest Service staff. Was just kind of a huge value add that I think wasn't really conceived of in that way. It was more of a pragmatic, practical thing of like, we need someone where for them to live, right? And it had these other benefits around trust building. I had this kind of bullet around partnership readiness. I think in a lot of ways that's similar to sort of this trust factor of like, again, not every unit within Forest Service necessarily was ready to jump aboard on this, and that's just another reality. I found that in New Mexico, we have a longer track record of working with the Forest Service, and I've started to work with the BLM a little more, and again, it's kind of that same pattern repeating where the BLM's not quite as sure about like what are these guys in New Mexico Wild up to, what do they want, what are they trying to do, and not quite as ready to dive in. And again, I think that gets back to kind of seeing these mutual benefits and building trust over time. I mentioned this kind of notion of really kind of important firewall between advocacy activities and federal funding used for stewardship, right? So that's something I would just kind of underscore. That's been kind of a facet of the work New Mexico Wild has done here, and kind of help to make this work successful. Another kind of lesson learned that's been really helpful is, as we build trust, and we, kind of work with a variety of staff with the federal agencies, people feel comfortable at times sharing information about things that are not necessarily going well, or decisions that are made that may not be appropriate or proper. And so that's another kind of benefit from this work, that again kind of comes out of trust. That wasn't again a design of our stewardship program, but it's been kind of another value add, is we're told, hey, like so and so decision maker is wanting to authorize chainsaw use for clearing trails in wilderness, and I just want you to know that, and I care personally about that, so I'm hoping you can help, right? So that kind of information, kind of we find people are willing to kind of share as we've kind of gotten to know folks and work together over the years. This stewardship work has also helped to kind of create what I would say is like resiliency within our organization. And that means that, when this started, Joelle was really managing the New Mexico Wild Wilderness Ranger program. She was in an organizer position. She'll correct me if I'm wrong here, and really kind of took this on out of a personal passion as a collateral duty. This was successful enough within the organization that when Joel moved to greener pastures, New Mexico Wild created a stewardship manager position. So that position works for me. That kind of manages the day-to-day work of our wilderness rangers and engages with other volunteers, other stewardship projects, and other outreach work kind of in the kind of in between times throughout the years. And so we have been able to leverage our stewardship work to contribute to the creation of a GIS position, for example, the stewardship manager position, a whole team of seasonal wilderness ranger positions. And so, it kind of increases overall funding diversity and therefore fiscal resiliency in the organization, so to speak, which is, I think, another kind of neat lesson learned. And then I will just say that, we're always continuing to learn and adapt. And like I mentioned, we're sort of continue to grow and evolve our stewardship program and what we're doing with these wilderness rangers and beyond with other volunteers. And so another kind of neat thing around like lesson learned is that, we kind of get into this work and opens up new insights and new doors into how we can be effective as an organization working with our communities and our partners and just kind of an ongoing journey of learning. So I'll hand it back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you. Okay, I'll jump into a couple things here. First thing that comes to mind in terms of lessons learned, having been in the West, but not having worked specifically with the agencies, is that the field office is not always the federal government. In other words, we started our program in 2016, and we've been under 3 administrations, 2 of which have been particularly unfriendly to us. And yet, at the same time, we've made a lot of friends because at the level at which a lot of people are working, they would rather work with us sometimes than work with other folks within their own organization. And that has been an opportunity for us to support them, to provide resources, help them do their job, and was just a surprise to me when we came across it. The few terms I throw out here: persistence, consistency, patience, being willing to begin again because people move around, remain that resource and that guide. We have so many people within our organization, within our wildlands team, who have been with us now, just a few left, for 30 or so years, who are just themselves maps of the landscape. And that institutional knowledge is essential. And we are now the harbingers of what will become that knowledge down the road. And it's essential that we continue to have it, share it, and implement it in the work that we're doing. The conservation movement is evolving. There's a lot to say about that, of course, and there's a lot that we just don't know yet. I have been surprised this year at how much wonderful work we've been able to get done, and I put that on my coworkers and my staff and their exceptional work, of course. But at the same time, it surprised me. We have at any moment thought, oh, we just don't know what's going to happen next. But there will always be a need for public lands management, and if certain entities can't do it, we will be there to do it. And you brought this up earlier, Bjorn, but one of the ways that we've talked about it in the past is that you can, let's say Utah designates or SUWA designates all of ARWA, and we get all the wilderness that we want. What does SUWA become? It becomes a stewardship program, in effect. It becomes the people on the ground helping to manage those lands. And so there's this vast potential future that may manifest or may not, or may piecemeal do so. And that is an important thing to keep in mind because I think it's a motivating thing. It keeps you going, or for me anyway, it keeps me going. And one of the things I've learned, I was taught to learn the landscape, learn how to navigate the landscape, learn what's going on the landscape. But the thing that has appealed maybe more than anything else to me are the people that I've met along the way, and the people who are the stewards. We call ourselves a stewardship program, but it's the people that we're working with who are the stewards of this place. And that, we call it philosophical or just, practical or cultural or whatever you want. That's something we seek to continue to foster And it's not necessarily something that's taught, in law school or in these other spaces. And so it's something we've learned on the ground, as we've been supported by uh, all of the other aspects of our organization. And that has been really special to me. You know, being able to make friends while doing this good work is exceptional. So how do we continue to foster this? I think it's a matter of growing our program, which we've done quite a bit, our field program. Early on, it was just myself. That was not enough. We now have a good group, an excellent group of people. What is growth and how much growth do you actually need? And what are you seeking to accomplish and what is enough? And sometimes, you recognize we'll never be able to do everything, but if we can shift the cultural perspective on what it means to visit public lands, through education, through demonstration, through naturalization that people don't even recognize as such. They just think that's how the landscape always was, but we were there the day before. That is a lesson learned for me that, puts things into perspective because the you can't do everything, but you can influence a lot of people in a lot of positive ways. And so largely those are my takeaways here. And here we are. So we have this questions and discussion section and one more slide after where I just threw in some prompts. You can ignore these. If you have your own questions, we can jump into them. These are just some things that we were thinking about that I wanted to throw out, particularly if you work in the field, or if you work in partnerships in any field, and again, any questions that you might have for myself or Bjorn.
Thanks so much to both of you. And I just want to, we're nearing the top of the hour, so I understand that some folks might have to jump off. If you do need to leave the meeting, but you have a burning question, feel free to put it into the chat and it will be included on the recording so you can get an answer to your question there. Since we are at the top of the hour, both Jeremy and Bjorn have offered to stay on a little bit longer. So if you have time to do that, we welcome you to do so and we'll jump into the Q&A. I do see a question here in the chat. Let me see if I can read the entire thing. Pete says, as a retired U.S. Forest Service federal government employee, I have long known and shared upfront with potential partners, wilderness and non-wilderness, that partnering and stewardship will always require the partners to contribute more than 50% to the partnership. The U.S. Forest Service talks the talk, and dedicated individual agency employees, managers, line officers may be engaged and do their best to contribute to the partnership and walk the walk, but it is almost never an equal partnership. The non-federal partners will always end up carrying more than 50% of the load. Do either of you want to respond to that? Or maybe, I'm not sure, Pete, if you were looking for a response, but since it's there, I'll put it out there.
Do you have a take on that, Bjorn, that you want to address?
Yeah, briefly, and just nice to see your name on the screen, Pete. I hope you're doing well. I guess I would say like I think that depends on like how we're defining what carrying more than 50% of the load is. I mean, in the case of New Mexico Wild's Wilderness Ranger program, I mean, it was 100% federal funded for many years. And so in one sense, our team was undertaking a majority of the wilderness stewardship work occurring on national forests in New Mexico. So we were carrying more than 50% of the partnership in that vein, but we would not have our program were it not for Forest Service funding. So, I mean, I think it kind of gets back to my premise around like there are benefits to all parties involved in these sort of stewardship partnerships, and that yeah, in some ways I would wholeheartedly agree with your comment around kind of carrying the work, but depending on how you define that, I think, and so I think New Mexico Wild has certainly seen its share of benefits from this work, and I don't tend to look at it as like, hey, we're not getting as much out of it. We share common goals, and then you have these other organizational benefits that come along. So I think valid point, but no matter how you define, the kind of weighting, I don't necessarily see that as like a negative per se, personally.
You guys mind if I comment on that? Because I think there's a part of the partnership, especially for the nonprofit side, that I think is really important, and especially now as we're experiencing cuts to federal funding and to some of these programs with partner organizations. And this does speak to Pete's statement. And I'm sorry if you guys already touched on this, but I really want to highlight it. When we have federal funding coming to nonprofits and those nonprofits are using that funding to engage people on the ground, yes, everybody's getting work done, we're accomplishing shared goals, but it is such an important way to engage new people and also new donors in your work. So that keeps that nonprofit thriving. And I just can't think of a better way to get people excited about giving to an organization than getting them out on the ground, giving them a way to touch the work, even if that's just sitting at a trailhead and talking to the visitors who are coming there. Um, and I don't know if you can really quantify that value because that can feed into not just the finances of the organization, but also your advocacy efforts, all the work that you're doing. So I just wanted to chime in with that. While we're waiting for other questions in the chat, I have a question for you guys. And I hope you have been there long enough to answer this question. What changes has the growth of your stewardship program had on the organization as a whole? And maybe a sidebar to that question is, have you seen adding the stewardship program change the culture and the way that you or the organization thinks about preserving and protecting wilderness?
Ask me in 2 years. However, I will say my initial response is yes, absolutely. Whether it was internally in the organization, or among agency partners, the first thing I'm often approached with when I enter a field office is thank you for doing this. There's a long history of other things, other interactions going on, and I've been surprised again and again about how grateful people are for the help. Within our organization, I've seen something very similar. People get excited about it. Um, People are really supportive of it, and I think one of my roles as it's evolved, a little bit more, a little bit less in the field and more, engaging with other staff members is how do I really interconnect that web? And so how do I work better with our legal team so that the issues that are occurring that they're aware of on the ground, for example, in the past, the Circle Cliffs out in Grand Staircase, Escalante, being queued to go do field work there to then now have, a gamut of projects that we, address out in that area. And so we're supporting in a way that they couldn't previously work that they want to see get done on the ground, and that I think is one of the best uses of a stewardship program internally at any organization. So
Yeah, and I think I would just echo something I talked about earlier in terms of sort of changing. I think Joel, you asked about changing the culture of the organization. How has stewardship contributed to that? And I would say that yeah, I don't want to pretend or say that like my current colleagues didn't understand the value of stewardship and the importance of stewardship in terms of like functionally protecting these places beyond the advocacy work. Like after the advocacy work is done, there's still a lot to do. I do think that the stewardship program though, like opened people's eyes to like how hard that work is, and so mad respect to like our federal partners with field-based positions, to our volunteers, to our staff. So I think it really kind of hit home this idea of yeah, the designation does not mean our work is done. If anything, it's just beginning in a lot of ways, right? And so I think that opened people's eyes to an extent that wasn't fully realized with kind of a larger focus on almost pure advocacy.
at an organization that doesn't have stewardship, which, we didn't until 10 years ago, it surprised me how much perceptions at times were that, we were just going out, we were going on trips. And, it's some of the hardest work you can imagine at the organization, physically, on the body, on the travel, the time. Everyone has a difficult job, each in their own way, intellectually and otherwise. It's not to diminish anyone at all. But there was a perception that, we're still working, I would say, on overcoming more broadly, not just at my organization, that things that are affiliated with manual labor to some degree are a lesser form of work than others. And this is, of course, the stewardship program is more than the manual labor. It's that and it's many other things, but it has caused challenges in the growth of the program at different times. But when you find the right people who get it and support it, they know exactly what you need. So that's important.
Thanks to you both. We've got a question from Fred in the chat. Do your projects require NEPA review and approval? If so, have you been successful in partnering with your land managers to take on some of the tasks and speed up the process? With what specific tasks have you been successful? Have you funded consultants to conduct portions of the assessment for land managers? That's several questions, so let me know if you need me to repeat any of those.
I can jump in first. A lot of the work that we do does not require NEPA. There are occasional projects that do. My experience working for the Forest Service was that some of the challenges in getting NEPA done revolved around things like really specialized work like archaeological survey, or kind of like wildlife biologists kind of writing the biological evaluation for the project. And so, we're not really qualified to do some of that work. So no, we have not done that. And then as far as the question of have we funded, the private sector kind of players to help with aspects of that, we have not really done that either. And that gets kind of back to like, limitations in resources. So in a scenario where, we've needed NEPA. It's tended to be a categorical exclusion, and we rely on a commitment by the agency partner to get that done. Particularly when we have grant funding tied to that project. And yeah, I think were we to look at something more significant, we would be having a conversation around like a longer project time frame. We might need a couple of years to get NEPA done, or can there be more move toward programmatic NEPA. We're getting into some of that with these post-fire trail restoration projects around forests, thinking about creative ways to provide NEPA coverage in a bigger gulp, so to speak, than project by project basis. And I think the last thing I would just say is that like where we might have an interesting project opportunity that required extensive NEPA that was not really feasible to get done, again, given our resource limitations, we probably would not commit to doing that project in the immediate term in hopes that some additional time could buy time for the NEPA to get done, and then knowing that there's plenty of other stewardship needs to be addressed in the meantime. So kind of scatter thoughts to those few questions from my perspective.
With regard to NEPA on our end, it comes up all the time. And whether it's something that really needs to get done or maybe sometimes is used as a hindrance to continuing to do the work that we want to get done, it's one or the other. However, I don't have knowledge of us ever contracting to do that work. We rely on primarily the BLM to get that work done. We've contracted for, archaeological surveys, cultural surveys, things of this nature. But NEPA is a process that we're reliant on our agency partners to complete. And often we get it done. It's great. Other times it is a true hindrance to doing something very simple. And maybe we transition from post and rail to buck and rail so we don't have to put any holes in the ground. So we make adjustments as we have to.
Thanks to you both. I might, if we don't have more questions popping in the chat, certainly if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll let you say it out loud or put it in the chat. But I would welcome folks to take a look at these discussion prompts. Are there any of these that pop out to you that you'd like to comment on? You're welcome to do that in the chat or raise your hand and speak out loud. I think these are some great questions that could spur some more conversation.
I can respond to one of them.
Go ahead.
Sure. One of the questions is, how has your organization's, in this case, it says advocacy, helped or hurt your stewardship work? I might have mentioned this earlier, but we're constantly litigating out of necessity. We're advocating. And as an organization that has almost doubled in size since I've started, we're still working out, staffing to some degree, the organization of teams, internal communication. It's something that I'm passionate about working on. But there have been numerous times, and we joke about it, it's not as funny to me, but that if a call is made or a lawsuit is filed, and the next day I have a meeting with that field office, we don't have a project. And so there's a lot of that happens. Advocacy wise, it could be similar, a little bit less than on the legal side. But at the same time, we're doing, I think, as an organization, a great job of working to align our organizing and advocacy and stewardship programs because just as a point of reference, our organization probably in the past 5 or so years has flipped from a staff that was largely folks that had been around 10, 30 years to now we have a staff that's probably 70% or more um, started within the past 2 to 5 years. And so that's a huge shift for our organization. And it's allowed us to have new conversations and look at how we collaborate internally differently. But yeah, stewardship work is often the first to get hit, just because of all the other activities that have been more longstanding at the organization.
Well, I hate to cut this short, but we're nearing our 15 minutes after the top of the hour point. So I'm posting some things in the chat here. I've got websites for both New Mexico Wild and Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, and you can find contact information for both Jeremy and Bjorn there if you have more specific questions for either one of them or just want to check out the amazing work that they're doing. So thanks so much, you guys, for taking time to present. I really learned a lot. I hope everybody here did as well. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And as a friendly reminder, we've recorded this webinar. We'll be posting it to NWSA's YouTube channel soon, and we'll also include links to the recording on NWSA's website, in addition to sending the recording to you all and everyone who registered via email. So please feel welcome to share the link in your circles. We really enjoy offering these webinars for free to our entire audience. If you or your organization are already a member of NWSA, you support this resource, so thank you so much. If you are not yet a contributor and really appreciate this content, we'd love to have you join us, so you can find a way to do that there in the chat. You can also stay up to date on our future webinars by subscribing to our newsletter and our YouTube channel. And you can always visit our website to see our full webinar lineup and connect with past webinars. So with that, that's a wrap. Thanks again, you guys. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope you all have an excellent week.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.
Yep, bye-bye.